In the blistering summer of 1863, while the thunder of cannons echoed across the fields of Gettysburg, some 300 miles to the north, something even darker, something unspeakable was unraveling in the sleepy hills of Middle Tennessee. Federal records, long buried beneath layers of secrecy, would eventually reveal a chilling truth. 73 souls, men, women, even children, had simply vanished over an 18-month span. Not escaped slaves, not deserters, not casualties of war. These were free men, local farm hands, hired laborers, and even entire neighboring families. All of whom had one thing in common: they asked too many questions about the fortune of the Halberd family. Yes, the Halberds, Tennessee's most prosperous cotton dynasty during the bloodiest chapter of American history. Their meteoric rise in the middle of wartime scarcity was too good to be true. And as you're about to discover, that's exactly what it was. The official reports were sealed under military order and stuffed deep into the Washington Archives files that wouldn't see daylight for more than a century. But it wasn't just the number of victims that shocked investigators. It was the efficiency, the cold clinical precision with which the Halberds erased them. Their belongings were logged like items in an estate sale. Their identities crossed out like expired accounts. And their bodies dissolved. Dissolved in chemical baths in the old sugar house. Gone without a trace. No graves, no markers, no chance for grieving families to say goodbye. Tonight, here on Sleepy History Tales, we're going to uncover the secrets buried under the rose gardens and marble columns of Halberd House, once known as Rosewood Estate. We'll follow the twisted legacy of patriarch Thaddeus Halberd and reveal how he turned blood into gold, and how that wealth was built atop 73 souls who were never meant to be found. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell, especially if you love true historical mysteries with a touch of the macabre. And if you're listening from Tennessee or anywhere near Rutherford County, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What do you know of Halberd House? Because after tonight, you may never see the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee the same way again. Halberd House rose like a crown jewel over the hills of Rutherford County, just 20 miles southeast of Nashville. A 3-story marvel of Greek revival design, flanked by 6 soaring Corinthian columns and double-tiered balconies, it gazed out over nearly 2,000 acres of black fertile soil that locals claimed could grow cotton on bone dust alone. It was built in 1834 by Thaddeus's father, Hollis Halberd, a man known as much for his sermons as for his spreadsheets. But by 1863, with war ripping the region apart, Halberd House was thriving. While other plantations suffered under blockade, drought, or desertion, Rosewood's warehouses were bursting with cotton bales, and not just ordinary cotton. Premium, bleached, pressed. The kind used for officer uniforms, war bandages, and paper currency. And Thaddeus. He was a man few dared challenge. At 42, he stood just over 6 feet tall, with ash-grey hair that caught the light like steel, and eyes so pale they appeared almost translucent. Southern charm dripped from his voice like molasses, but those who truly knew him knew better. Beneath the silk cravat and tailored coats was a mind sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, cold, deliberate, calculating. A man who didn't just survive the war economy, he bent it to his will. When Union troops approached Nashville in early 1862, most plantation owners either fled or declared allegiance. But Thaddeus, he stayed, claimed neutrality. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he was negotiating double contracts, selling his cotton to Confederate quartermasters, and then, when Union forces intercepted those shipments, selling it again at an even higher price. Twice paid for the same bale. Twice innocent in the eyes of either army. The Halberd twins. Daniel and Samuel had inherited their parents' brilliance, but none of their restraint. At 21, Daniel, older by 17 minutes, was wiry, pale, and always fidgeting with the rim of his spectacles whenever something particularly nasty crossed his mind. He had once studied chemistry and accounting at the University of Tennessee before the war shattered the academic world. That unfinished education, it turns out, would become disturbingly useful for the family's hidden endeavors. His brother Samuel was built differently, broad-shouldered, thick-wristed, with hands that looked like they could crush hammers. While Daniel sketched out plans, Samuel carried them out without hesitation, without mercy. Even Thaddeus Halberd, a man no stranger to cruelty, sometimes watched his youngest son with a flicker of concern in his eyes. Then came the spring of 1862, and with it, chaos. Union troops swarmed into Nashville. Confederate militias prowled the woods and hills. The Cumberland River turned into a chessboard of stolen shipments and silent deals. Most plantations lost their enslaved workers to freedom or conscription, but not Halberd House. Somehow, impossibly, the fields at Rosewood were full. At sunrise, silent. Laborers emerged like ghosts from their quarters' faces, always hidden under broad hats and kerchiefs. At dusk, they vanished again. No names, no voices, no questions. Locals whispered, "Of course." Where does he find them? Why do none ever come to town? But the truth was much darker than even the most suspicious neighbor dared imagine. After Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in late 1862, Thaddeus Halberd faced a choice: lose his workforce or adapt. And so, ever the tactician, he shifted his strategy. He began hiring laborers, both freedmen and desperate white men, offering what seemed like a generous wartime wage: $2 a day, room, board, a contract, better than factory pay in Nashville or Memphis. But there was a catch, a fine print clause buried deep in the contract. Laborers must remain at Rosewood for 2 full years, no early departures, and no wages until the contract's completion. At first glance, it sounded fair, maybe even smart. But as you and I both know, here on Sleepy History Tales, contracts like that in times like these tend to hide the worst kind of intentions, and the cracks in the facade began to show quickly. It started with a widow. In November of 1862, a woman named Martha Henley rode into Murrell's Hollow Courthouse. She was old, tired, but determined. Her brother Thomas Henley had recently taken work at Rosewood. A blacksmith by trade, Thomas had lost his shop to Union requisition troops, and desperate had signed on with the Halberds 6 weeks earlier. He had promised to send word once he got his first paycheck, but no letter came. No message, nothing. So Martha rode out to the plantation herself. She knocked at the grand front doors. The one who answered was Daniel Halberd, glasses glinting in the sunlight, a cold smile playing on his lips. He told her that Thomas had been dismissed for drinking, that he'd broken the rules and forfeited his pay. Martha stood silent. Then her voice cracked. My brother hasn't touched a drop in 7 years. Not since Papa died from the bottle. Thomas swore on his grave he'd never drink again. And I believe him. As true as gospel. The next morning she walked into the office of Sheriff Coleman Briggs, hands trembling as she held out a faded daguerreotype of Thomas. A photograph of a man with calloused hands and kind eyes. A man who, as she put it, never broke a promise in his life. Sheriff Briggs, a quiet man who'd known the Halberds for 2 decades, listened carefully. He assured Martha he would look into it. But something about her voice and that photo lodged itself deep in his mind like a splinter. Thomas Henley had been well known in Murrell's Hollow, a dependable craftsman, a man of his word. It didn't sit right, not one bit, and that, dear listeners, is when things began to unravel. Sheriff Briggs had seen plenty of men crumble under pressure. He'd seen lies, broken promises, even good folk turn to vice in desperate times. But Thomas Henley. The idea that he'd slipped back into drinking and abandoned his tools, and word it just didn't fit. Still, wartime changed people. And after all, the mind is a fragile thing when hope is stripped away. That afternoon, Sheriff Briggs rode to Halberd House. He found Thaddeus Halberd already waiting on the grand front steps, dressed in a pristine black coat that shimmered slightly in the sun. A leather-bound ledger rested in one gloved hand, his stance composed. Too composed. I anticipated your visit. Sheriff Thaddeus said, his voice smooth as silk and laced with the practiced accent of a Virginia aristocrat. It pains me to report that Mr. Henley was regrettably unreliable. We caught him stealing tools from the forge, and we found a bottle of whiskey in his quarters. I have the statements here, 3 witnesses, all consistent. He opened the ledger slowly, like a priest unveiling scripture. Briggs scanned the pages. Everything looked correct. Too correct. The witness names jumped out at him. Samuel Halberd, Thaddeus's hulking son and head overseer Josiah Creek, an old field hand with fading eyesight. Moses Washington, a newly hired laborer who claimed to have seen Thomas drinking behind the cotton gin that very week. The handwriting matched. The dates were aligned. The description of the incident was precise and tidy. Too tidy. Briggs's gut shifted. Thaddeus's voice never wavered. His grey eyes locked on the sheriff's face, watching not with concern but with calculation, like a chess player testing for weakness. And then there was the smell. Not manure, not sweat, not smoke, something else. A harsh, bitter chemical tang that lingered around the barn and crept into the folds of Briggs's coat. It reminded him of the tannery down by the river, but stronger. Wrong somehow. Discipline, Thaddeus said. Snapping the ledger shut with a loud crack is what separates order from chaos in times such as these. Henley was given a chance. He squandered it. I trust you understand. Briggs nodded, slowly slipped the papers into his coat. But as he turned his horse and rode away from Rosewood Manor, the air felt heavier, the sun colder. His instincts, which had never failed him in 15 years of service, were screaming. Something wasn't right. 3 days later, the town woke to horror. Martha Henley's body was found floating in Stone's River. Her old mare was grazing peacefully nearby rains, caught in a briar bush. No marks on her body, no blood, no bruises, just a single shoe missing, and her reticule gone. Inside that reticule, as every townsperson knew, she always carried a daguerreotype of her brother. The coroner, Mr. Felton, called it an accident. Recent rains had swollen the river. The banks were slick. But Sheriff Briggs couldn't accept that. Not really, especially not when more names started appearing. The winter of 1862 into 1863 passed quietly at Rosewood Manor. Too quietly. But in the surrounding counties, questions were beginning to grow like weeds. James Patterson, a skilled carpenter from Shelbyville, had taken work at the Halbert Plantation in early December. His wife Sarah received one letter, just one, in January. It was his handwriting, his calm tone. He said he was working hard and that she should wait for him until his contract was done. But the letters stopped after that. In March, Sarah gathered her courage and made the long, muddy journey to Rosewood. The answer she received chilled her to the bone. James. Oh. He left without notice, Daniel Halbert had told her. Took off one morning. Never said a word. Left all his belongings behind. Left everything behind, including the silver locket she gave him on their wedding day. Then came Eleanor Walsh, a young Irish immigrant, trying to escape the chaos of Nashville. In January, she was hired as a seamstress at Rosewood. Her landlady, Mrs. Doyle, remembered how excited she'd been her first real job. And at such a fine house, she left with only a small carpet bag and a smile. She never came back. Her trunk, her comb, even her worn-out shoes were still in her room months later. Mrs. Doyle lit a candle for her every Sunday. But no one ever saw Eleanor again. And perhaps most haunting of all was the Freeman family. Isaac Freeman, a seasoned cotton gin mechanic. His wife, Ruth, a cook. Their sons, Jacob and Benjamin, both strong boys of 16 and 17. In February, they sold their small homestead near Franklin. Everything they had was loaded into a single wagon, furniture, tools, quilts, hand-stitched by Ruth's grandmother. They were promised full-time wages, board, and room at Halbert House. Neighbors remembered waving goodbye. The Freeman boys had shouted promises to write, but none of them were ever seen again. Now I ask you listeners, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a seamstress, an entire family of 4, all vanished, all traced back to one place, and every time, the story was the same. They broke contract. They left. They vanished. But do you believe that many workers, honest, skilled workers, would all disappear willingly, leaving behind their belongings and their lives? If you were the sheriff, what would you do next? Because for Sheriff Briggs, things were just beginning. The sudden abandonment of his duties, his drinking, and his complete disappearance from the life of honesty shocked many in the area. Quiet, kind, and devoted as he was, the idea that he would become a petty thief seemed absurd. But war can change even the best of souls. When Inspector Elijah Briggs rode up to Rosewood Manor that fateful afternoon, he was not expecting anything special. But standing at the front door was Bartholomew Alden, the master of Rosewood, dressed in a neat black suit, holding a thick leather notebook as if he had been waiting. "Inspector, I knew you would come," Alden said, his voice carrying an Eastern aristocratic accent despite having lived in Tennessee for more than 30 years. "I regret to say that Mr. Henley has committed a serious breach of discipline. He was caught stealing tools from the blacksmith shop, and we found liquor in his room. I have the full statements of three witnesses, who Lucas Alden Bartholomew's brother and foreman, Silas Creed, a veteran worker, and Moses Washington, a free black man who worked in the cotton fields. The paperwork was perfect. The dates matched. The handwriting was consistent. But the way Bartholomew presented it, so well-groomed, so ready, made Briggs feel that something was wrong. Bartholomew's grey eyes never blinked, watching Briggs's reactions, every gesture, every word. And the smell in the air, a sharp chemical smell like that around the tannery, but stronger, deeper, and more wrong. "I hope you understand," Inspector Bartholomew said as he slammed the notebook shut. "Discipline is the order of the day." Briggs nodded, tucking the papers into his coat. But as he left Rosewood, he felt a cold stone press against his chest. It was all too perfect. And it was that perfection that was terrifying. 3 days later, the body of Clara Henley Horace's sister was found floating in the Stone River. There was no sign of violence, just a slip, the official verdict said. But her bag was missing. The photograph of Horace, which she had carried everywhere since his disappearance. The winter of 1862 passed strangely quiet. But the neighborhood began to shake as more people disappeared. James Fletcherson, a carpenter from Shelbyville, was hired in December. His wife received a single letter, then nothing more. When she arrived at Rosewood, she was told that he had left, leaving all his belongings behind. Eleanora Walsh, an Irish girl from Nashville, was hired as a seamstress. She left the boarding house with a small bag, telling everyone that the place treated her like family. No one saw her again. The most terrifying case was the case of Isaac Freeman's family. His wife Ruth and 2 sons. They sold their house, sold their land, brought the whole family to Rosewood in the hope of changing their lives. And then disappeared completely. Every time Briggs investigated, Bartholomew presented papers always detailed, always with witnesses. Always the same scenario. The missing person was a thief, a drunk, an irresponsible person. But there was one person who no longer believed. Silas Creed, the veteran supervisor. He had lived long enough to be used to cruelty, used to whip people without blinking. But what was happening in Rosewood was no longer punishment. It was cold-blooded calculation. Creed took notes silently. The rice books, the food, all showed that there were only 39 people working, not the reported 67. So where were the other 28? Then he began to see them. Strange figures appeared late at night, following Lucas and Nathaniel Alden, the youngest brother. 2 tall, thin, pale men wearing leather gloves carrying medical bags. Each time they came, the next morning a worker was gone. No furniture, no trace. The room was as empty as if no one had ever lived there. On damp April night, Creed could stand it no longer. He followed the Alden brothers as they turned into the cabin of Benjamin Carter, a free black man from Memphis who had been working there for only 3 weeks. Carter had asked too many questions about his missing friends, about the real number of people on the estate. 20 minutes later, Lucas and Nathaniel left the cabin carrying a large sack. In the moonlight, Creed saw bloodstains. The bag heaving. They walked quickly, almost hurriedly, toward the old cemetery on the hill behind the cotton press, where 3 generations of the Alden family were buried. Creed followed quietly. What do you think is really going on in Rosewood? Is it a web of crime covered up by fame and forged documents? Or is it something even darker? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, take a look at the old walls. Sometimes they hold more than you think. White marble headstones, intricately carved and shipped all the way from Georgia, marked the resting places of the victims in the official cemetery. But that night, instead of stopping at that sacred boundary, the brothers Daniel and Samuel continued deeper into the woods, where flickering firelight filtered through the trees, hiding behind an ancient oak tree. Hidden in the darkness, Creek watched with growing horror as the brothers were joined by their father Ezekiel and 2 strange men. Pale men he had seen several times before on his strange nocturnal journeys. As if they had done this many times before, the group quietly lowered a sack of burlap into the previously dug hole. But this was no ordinary burial. One of the strangers uncorked a large glass bottle filled with a clear liquid and began pouring it over the body in the hole. The air was immediately filled with the pungent smell of chemicals, the same smell that had made Sheriff Briggs suspicious during the previous investigation. The smell of quicklime. Ezekiel Chamberlain stood at the edge of the grave, his voice as soft as the wind through dry leaves, but Creek heard it enough to send a chill down his spine. 73 souls to build an empire, each one a brick in the foundation of our dynasty. What we do tonight will ensure the prosperity of this family, even when this war is a forgotten memory. When the grave was filled in and carefully camouflaged with leaves and vegetation, the group quietly parted. Ezekiel headed back toward the mansion, while his 2 sons and the 2 strangers turned toward a large barn, a place Creek had thought was used to store farm tools. Curiosity now giving way to bitter suspicion, Creek followed, approaching and peering through the wooden planks of the warehouse. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life and make him realize he was in the service of something less than human. The warehouse had been transformed into a workshop of death, a nightmarish factory designed to systematically dispose of human remains. Along one wall were rows of large wooden vats filled with quicklime solution, a chemical that accelerated decomposition, dissolving the flesh without leaving a trace except for what could be recovered and sold for money. Wooden paddles stirred metal screens, strained out what didn't dissolve. Along long tables, personal items were neatly sorted, jewelry, tools, clothing, all laid out like the wares of a death shop. And then Creek recognized the familiar objects: the leather belt of Thomas Henley, the missing blacksmith, the silver pendant of Elelanena Walsh, and the wedding rings lined up in a small wooden box, unmistakably the Freeman's. In the corner of the room, a red-hot furnace was used to melt gold and silver, making unmarked ingots ready to be sent to market without raising suspicion of their grisly origins. But what most chilled Creek were the ledgers on the table near the exit. In Daniel Chamberlain's neat, cool handwriting, each line was not a record of cotton or cattle harvests, but of human lives reduced to numbers and profits. Thomas Henley, November 15, 1862. Silver tools and watches, $47. James Patterson, December 22nd, 1862. Carpenter's tools and gold ring, $89. Elena Walsh, January 18, 1863. Sewing supplies and silver pendant, $23. Freeman family, February 8, 1863. Wagons, tools, household goods, personal effects, 156. The entries ran for dozens of pages. Each entry, a person who had come to Rosewood Manor, hoping for honest work, only to find a quiet death. The total value of the 73 victims' assets was over $4,000. A figure that would explain why the Chamberlain family continued to be wealthy at a time when most of the surrounding plantations were in ruins due to the war. But for Creek, the truth was much more frightening. It wasn't just about the money. The Chamberlains were not desperate men of the times. They were organized monsters acting in cold blood for one reason, only power, and the legacy of an evil empire. The tombstone was carved with intricate inscriptions, carved in rare white marble, shipped all the way from Georgia. But what held Caleb Creek's attention was the way the Greymont heirs, the twins Elias and Silas, didn't stop at the main grave. They carried torches into the woods behind them, where light flickered between the old trunks hidden behind a monumental oak. From their hiding place, Creek watched with bated breath. Their father, Thaddeus Greymont, appeared accompanied by two strange men, sunken eyes, pale skin like corpses rising from the grave. They placed a thick cloth bag in the pre-dug hole. One of the strangers pulled out a large glass jar containing a clear, pungent liquid. The smell the same one that had Sheriff Rowe coughing during the recent investigation was quicklime, a chemical used to quickly decompose bodies. Thaddeus stood at the edge of the pit, his voice so soft that only the most attentive could hear it. 73 souls for a strong empire. Each flesh is a brick in the Greymont house. What we do tonight will ensure our children's wealth when this whole war is but a pale footnote in the history books. When the pit was filled and covered with fallen leaves and wild grass, the group dispersed. Thaddeus returned to the mansion while his two sons and the two strange figures headed for the large barn, which Creek had thought was just a storage place for farm tools. But now he was driven by a sense of horror that reason could not contain. Creeping closer to the barn, he peered through the gaps in the rotten wooden planks. And then, what he saw took his breath away. The stables no longer a tool shed. They were a factory of death designed for the systematic disposal of human remains. A row of large wooden vats filled with quicklime solution were lined one wall. Wooden paddles were used to stir metal mesh. Screens were used to filter out the indestructibles. Rings, watches, necklaces. Creek froze as he recognized the familiarity of the objects. Tom Henley's leather belt, Ellen Ward's silver pendant, and a small wooden box inside of which were the Freedman family's wedding rings. In another corner was a red-hot furnace where they melted gold and silver into anonymous ingots, easily sold without question. And then he saw the cruelest thing of all, a stack of ledgers in Elias Greymont's neat, unmistakable handwriting. But no records of cotton or livestock production. It was a list of those who had been killed, name by name, date of arrival, date of death, and valuation. Tom Henley, 11/15, 1862, tools, plus silver watch, 47th, James Patterson, 12/22/1862, carpenter's tools, Pulse gold ring, $89. Ellen Ward, 1 var Lutsen 63. Sewing tools plus silver pendant, $23. Friedman family, 2 Estate 1863, wagons, household goods, $156. Total number of people listed, 73. Total value over $4,000. A huge sum in wartime when other plantations were in ruins. But Creek soon learned that this was not about money. The Greymonts were not acting out of desperation. They were systematic, sophisticated, cold-blooded killers. Everything was meticulously planned. Ads in Tennessee and Kentucky, newspapers offered workers high wages, good housing. But the victims were always widows, immigrants, newly freed, blacks, people with no one waiting for them to return. A network of boarding houses and labor agents took commissions to introduce prey and provided details of assets, occupations, and weaknesses. The two strangers. Creek now knew their names. Dr. Cornelius Polk and his brother Edgar had been medical officers in the Confederate Army deserters after the Battle of Shiloh. One was a doctor, the other a chemist perfect for the role of a silent killer. They used chloroform and morphine. The bodies were clean, not a bruise. This was a human slaughterhouse. Creek understood run like an industrial plant. But then, crack. Creek's foot caught on a rotten plank. The sound rang out, tearing the night apart. The silence in the barn was gone. Inside, someone growled. "Who's out there?" Elias's voice. "Silas, get the dogs out. Search the woods if you have to." Creek ran. His breathing was rapid. The dark forest seemed to be swallowing him up. Behind him, the dogs barked. The search order echoed through the trees. Don't let him escape. He knows. Creek had one advantage. 30 years of living in this land. He knew every trail, every tree, every hidden crevice in the rocks by heart. But he also knew if he was caught, he would be the 74th name in that fateful notebook. Are you still following? If this part makes you shiver, share it with a friend who also loves to explore dark mysteries. Hit like and don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, because the darkest part of this story is yet to come. As Creek fell into a dry creek bed, the sound of bones breaking echoed coldly. The hounds were still closing in. The darkness was closing in around him. And above him, the footsteps began to gather. Inside the barn at Rosewood, federal investigators found not just what Creek had described, buckets of quicklime piles of neatly sorted clothing, but a murder system so organized and so cold it would make even veterans of war shudder. On a rotting wooden table, they found detailed maps marking the locations of 73 unmarked graves scattered throughout the woods surrounding the plantation. Each grave was marked with a simple wooden stake with only a number on it. And those numbers matched perfectly with the notebooks of Daniel Chamberlain, now renamed Lawrence Callahan, the family's cold-blooded eldest son. The notebooks listed not only the looted goods, but also detailed notes about each victim, their skills, their family status, their physical characteristics, as if he were assessing the assets of a ranch. The writer didn't just want to plunder, he wanted to control death. In the early accounts, they even experimented with crude ways to kill poison-staged accidents. But over time, The techniques became more sophisticated, more subtle, less detectable. The Polk brothers, now Cornelius and Ezra Pike, were former Confederate Army doctors. They brought medical knowledge to kill without leaving a trace. Injections, fake reactions like flu strokes, falls, all studied as if they were experiments in a horrifying laboratory. But the scariest thing wasn't the graves. It wasn't the bodies melted in quicklime. It was a business plan, written in the handwriting of Ezekiel Chamberlain, now known as Ambrose Callahan. The document detailed the family's post-war ambitions to expand its murderous model. In it, Ambrose calculated that the post-war Reconstruction era would create millions of anonymous vulnerable people, former slaves, immigrants, working-class people, and that all of them would become raw material for a large-scale murder enterprise. Murder as an industry. And then, when the army surrounded the estate, Rosewood was empty. The Callahans had disappeared into the night. Someone in town had warned them. They had taken only enough for a horseback ride. They left behind tons of cotton cattle machinery and bloody secrets that could not be denied. Days later, the bodies of the Pike brothers were found floating in the Cumberland River, their throats slashed to the spine. Who the knifeman was, no one knew for sure, but someone in the Callahan family had no intention of leaving witnesses. The exhumation lasted 3 weeks. The army had to borrow engineers from the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad to open the graves. The quicklime had destroyed most of the bodies. Only fragments of bone and rotting cloth remained, tiny clues that confirmed Creek's story. The Callahan family's network was not limited to the estate. Investigators traced it to Nashville, Louisville, St. Louis, where accomplices including boarding house owners, labor brokers, and even some local newspaper editors had worked together to inform and broker targets. The network had been running for nearly 2 years, generating huge profits. While the rest of the region was in dire straits due to the war, the Callahans lived on wine silk and the quiet smiles of those who were never suspected. A nationwide manhunt was issued. Rewards were offered in the thousands. Their portraits were plastered across the South and the North. Some reports even said they had crossed the border into Mexico. Some say the Callahans fled to South America. Others swear they saw Ambrose Callahan board a ship at Mobile Harbor, carrying false British passports, a young woman and a child whose identities no one could identify. But no one ever saw them again. Nowhere on a map did they survive or die. The rumors persisted for decades. Some reported seeing Lawrence Callahan running a drug factory in Brazil. Others claimed he lived under an assumed name in a town in the south of France, living into his 70s in a stone house by the sea. Some historians believe the family was assassinated by the Confederates themselves, as they fled considered traitors. Still others say they were executed by Union forces under top secret orders, shoot on the spot without trial. There were no bodies. There were no graves. There was only money, a lot of it missing, from bank accounts, from safes, from the secret vaults in the Rosewood vaults, and enough money to buy another life under another name, anywhere in the world. Rosewood Manor was seized by the federal government and turned into a military hospital for Union soldiers. What had once been a slaughterhouse was now a place of healing. The basement that had once held quicklime and corpses was now a warehouse of medicine and hospital beds. The paradox was obvious. After the war, the Callahans' former cotton fields were redistributed to former slaves, displaced whites, and wandering refugees. A small community emerged. People who had been victims of history now farmed, built homes, and tried to erase the blood that stained the land. And the mansion? Beautiful white, towering with stone columns like a Greek temple. It stood alone for nearly 20 years after the war. No one dared touch it. No builder would undertake the restoration work. They spoke of lonely footsteps echoing in the middle of the night, knocking from the crypt. The feeling that someone was always standing behind them, watching. In 1884, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad bought the land, demolished the mansion to build a freight station. No one objected. No one regretted it. Today, what was once the center of the Rosewood murderous empire is just a street crowded with trucks and warehouses. Everything has been flattened except one thing. A small bronze plaque erected by the state of Tennessee in 1963, exactly 100 years after the excavation. It reads, "In memory of the victims of Rosewood Manor." Their names, God knows them. Passers-by rarely stop to read, but in Murraysboro, the old folks still pass on the story of the silence that surrounds evil, of the cotton empire built with sweat and blood. Josiah Creek, the courageous manager who exposed the Callahan family's crimes, survived the war. With a broken leg that never fully healed, he hobbled through small towns helping the federal government find the victims. Each letter was a stab in the heart. He never married, had no children, never laughed loudly in public. Neighbors said he always looked over his shoulder, always lit candles at night, as if apologizing to someone, or as if afraid someone would come back. At the post-war court, Marshall Creek's testimony helped establish the first legal precedent for the concept of war crimes on American soil. A concept that had never existed before. The accomplices he exposed, the innkeepers, the merchants, the body carriers were mostly arrested, but many were given suspended sentences. A few were pardoned if they cooperated. They lived. They were forgotten. Creek could not forget. In 1889, 26 years after the discovery of the 73 unmarked graves, Creek was found dead in a log cabin on the edge of the Rosewood estate. On the wooden table was a sealed letter addressed to the Tennessee State Historical Society. The envelope bore only one line, "Until I am dead, the contents of the letter have never been published. The Historical Society has never let the press read it." But one of the archivists before he died whispered in an interview, not all he saw were human beings. What do you think? Do you believe the Callahans died in the woods, or are they sitting somewhere in Europe drinking wine, reading old news about themselves? And if such a murderous empire could survive so quietly for so many years, how many other Rosewoods are buried beneath the foundations of the roads we travel every day? Creek died on a damp autumn morning in 1889 in a small log cabin next to the old Rosewood property. Locals said that the night before someone had seen a light flickering in the woods and heard a steady series of metallic knocks as if someone were ringing a bell underground. When Creek was found, he was sitting upright at his desk, his eyes wide open, staring into the darkness outside the window. On the desk was a small, carefully sealed wooden box. Inside was his last handwritten document, an address to the Tennessee Historical Society. What Creek left behind shocked the historical world. He claimed that the 73 graves were just the tip of the iceberg. The real number, he said, could be as high as 100 or more. Nameless, undocumented, unclaimed immigrants, runaway slaves, single women, lost souls who made no sound as they disappeared. Rosewood Manor was more than a murder site. It was a human flesh-crushing machine, lubricated by money and silence. Creek confessed he had long suspected. The fewer meals despite the same number of workers, the strange noises at night, the averted eyes when he asked about missing people. But he was afraid. Who wouldn't be afraid of the Chamberlain family? The power, the fame, the political connections, and later he discovered the covert protection of those who were supposed to protect justice. The most haunting part of the document was not the number of victims, but what Creek revealed: Rosewood was not alone. He had heard of other plantations with private warehouses, with nighttime wagons, with medics who came and disappeared. In the chaos of war, many fertile lands had been watered with blood and tears. Only they had never been dug up to know. How many more Rosewoods are there to be found, buried beneath the soil of history? By the time the Historical Society published its documents, it was the turn of the 20th century. The names that once ruled the South were now dust. None of the Chamberlains were convicted. None stood trial. None looked their victims in the eye and admitted their guilt. They vanished like vapor after a night of rain. Some said they died on the run, murdered by troops on both sides for treason. Others claimed to have seen Ezekiel Chamberlain boarding a ship leaving Mobile Harbor, carrying a false passport bearing the British royal seal. Some said he lived in Lisbon. Some said Argentina. No one had proof. No one really knew. Rosewood was later requisitioned by the Union government, becoming a field hospital for wounded Union soldiers. Where once it was filled with corpses, now it rang with the groans of dying soldiers, a strangely poignant paradox. After the war, the land was divided among white refugees and freed slaves. The white pillars of the mansion gradually collapsed in the wind and rain. No one cleaned up. No one dared to stay. It is said that every time someone came to repair it, there was an accident. Saws broke, scaffolding collapsed. People fell from the roof to the ground as if someone had pushed them. Footsteps were heard in the hallways, shrill laughter echoed from the buried cellar. Finally, in 1884, the mansion was leveled. A railroad track was built on that land. The trains still run by every night, blowing their long whistles as they pass that cold stretch of land. Today, on a busy commercial street corner in Murraysboro, there is a small stone plaque, quiet, inconspicuous. It reads, "In memory of the victims of Rosewood Manor. Their names are known to God alone. Passers-by do not bother to look. Children run past without understanding. But on winter nights, when the north wind blows, people sometimes say they hear the sound of a hoe. Rattle, rattle. Like someone is digging for something that has yet to be discovered." Do you believe the Chamberlain family escaped to a life of leisure in Europe? Or are they still out there under the cold earth, never really leaving? How many more Rosewood Manors have yet to be excavated? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this terrifying tale. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with your fellow historical mystery enthusiasts. See you in the next story. And don't forget, sometimes the scariest monsters don't have horns, don't have claws. They simply know how to laugh at the right time.